Hey guys, so I know that this is not normal. Um, I've never gone live before, and I'm pretty sure nobody's gonna see me go live. I didn't really tell anybody, but um, I needed a way to get my videos on YouTube, and my tablet won't let me share them from my camera roll, so I have to do it this way. So I'm talking about Gary Heidnick. Now, Gary Heidnick is kind of a graphic story, so just so you know. Now, with a little luck, lives may have been saved. Because on November 26th in 1986, Sarah Lindsley, who was a mildly mentally disabled African-American young woman, she lived in northern Philadelphia with her mother, she went to the corner drugstore to pick up a package of Midol. It doesn't tell us if she ever made it to the corner store or not, so hours went by and she didn't return, and her mother, Jeanette Perkins, went searching for her. And she spent the whole weekend looking for her daughter. And on Monday, she contacted a friend of her daughter's. His name was Cyril Tony Brown, is what they called him. Now, Brown did not know where Sandra was, and he asked Jeanette if she had tried the home of Gary Heidnick. Now, Gary Heidnick was a white man in his early 40s, and he was a friend of Sandra and Tony. So Sandra had been to his house on multiple occasions, but her mother had not tried there. So she went over to his house at 3520 North Marshall Street. And it was a house in a neighborhood that vaguely resembled Berlin after World War II and was nicknamed the OK Corral because of the numerous gunfights between drug dealers. I don't think the OK Corral was drug dealers, but there were gunfights there. I've been to it a couple times. So Heidnick had only paid $15,500 for the single-family home, and it would be appraised at only $3,000 less than a year later, which is crazy. It dropped worth like that. So Jeanette knocked on Heidnick's door, and no one answered, so she left. But she returned a couple of times that day to no answer. And actually, as she was knocking on his door, her daughter was inside the house. So if Sandra had screamed or if Jeanette had called the police, Sandra's life would have been saved. Later, there was a smell, and it is described as an atrocious gagging kind of smell was coming from the house on Marshall Street, and it was so powerful that it could be smelled along the entire block. Okay, if it can be smelled on the whole block, I can't imagine the smell inside the house. Now, Heidnick had not been seen for quite some time, and so the neighbors assumed that the smell might be his rotting corpse. So they called the police. A detective went to the house and pounded on the door, and this time, Gary Heidnick, a good-looking man with dark hair and eyes, opened up. Now, that's Gary Heidnick. In my opinion, not really a good-looking guy, but they say Ted Bundy's attractive too, so. Now, the detective, his name was Detective Aponte. That's how I'm going to say it. I'm not sure that's correct. Detective Aponte inquired as to the stench. Heidnick said that he had just burned his dinner. I have a feeling that's not right. Astonishingly, this detective accepted that answer. So he's obviously not a very good detective because people living on the block think it's a rotting corpse, and he's like, oh, no, it's just burned dinner. Like, seriously? He's not a very good detective. Now, the stench had been permeating the neighborhood for days. Now, if only he had not accepted the explanation, but instead had insisted on being let in, he might have saved Sandra's life. Now, indeed, Heidnick was cooking something. It was not his dinner, but the ribcage of a human being. So not only is he a killer, he's a cannibal too. So the details, as they were revealed later, were to be some of the most shocking that Philadelphia could ever have imagined. So, in essence, Gary Heidnick ran a mini slave colony of African-American women in his basement, keeping them chained, abusing and beating them, feeding them a blend of dog food and human flesh. So he wasn't even feeding them what they should be eating. And, the starving women were eventually forced to eat this because they were so hungry, and then they were sexually abused as well. Now, it all started with Josefina Rivera. She was a slim prostitute with a pretty hard face. I don't know what that means. I don't know if that means that she's like scary or if she just has resting bitch face or what, but that's what it says, pretty hard face. Now, on November 26th of 1986, which would have been the same day that Sandra went missing, she was working the corner of 3rd and Girard Streets and hoping to meet a John. So a John is somebody who picks up prostitutes, basically. All told, it had been a miserable night for her. She had an argument with her boyfriend. She was broke, and in an hour or so, it would be officially Thanksgiving Day. The night was miserable, cold, damp, and windy, so she's probably freezing. She was wearing a thin jacket, because she's a prostitute, and her thin legs were encased in skin-tight jeans, again, because she's a prostitute. So she hoped she would turn at least one trick, but as time went by, her prospects got dimmer, and there were very few Johns cruising by that night. So she noticed a Cadillac Coupe de Ville had stopped. The window lowered electronically, which is pretty cool, especially in 1986, and the driver, which was a middle-aged white man, asked what she charged. So she gave him a high figure, and eventually they settled on only $20. So he invited her into the car, and she got in. Now, he was dressed in a French leather jacket and wore a Rolex, so he looks like he's doing pretty well for himself at the time. The car was fairly new and heavily customized with chrome, and figured the man had money to spend. He told her he was going to take her to his house. They stopped to buy coffee, and then he drove at Daytona 500 speed through the empty, wet streets to his house on North Marshall. Now, his home was different from many others in the area. Although the house was run down, it stood alone from most houses, which were attached to another home on one side. His was not. It had a dilapidated garage, which others did not, and in that garage was a 1971 Rolls Royce. The garage was lined with steel to protect the car against errant shots from the shootouts. And a few years earlier, Heidnick, who had a genius IQ and was really good at playing the stock market, had paid $17,000 cash for it, a withdrawal that hardly dented his money market account with Merrill Lynch of more than $500,000. So in the house, he brought Josefina upstairs to a bedroom, which the dominant feature was a waterbed. He paid her the agreed on $20, then took off his clothes and got in bed with her. They had intercourse for a while, and then suddenly he changed. He grabbed her around the neck and started to choke her. And terrified, she said she would do whatever he wanted if he just kept her alive. So he led her downstairs to the first floor, then down another flight of stairs into the basement, a dark and dingy place that had a dirt floor. Suddenly, he cuffed her hands. The cuffs were then secured to a chain, which in turn was linked to a metal bar that ran the length of the ceiling. She was like an animal in a pen. Then he went upstairs and went to sleep. 3 days later, he brought down another woman who was African American too, and she was plump. Her name was Sandra Lindsley. Like Josefina, he cuffed and chained Sandra to the metal bar. Now, she's a little mentally slow. It does not tell us what we know. It doesn't tell us anything else. It doesn't tell us, how slow she was. It doesn't tell us if she understood what was going on or if she thought it was a game or what. But, yeah. After he brought Sandra down, the sex started. And every day from that point on, every day, Heidnick had sex with both of them, including intercourse and other acts. He seemed insatiable and liked humiliating and dominating the woman. A particular favorite was forcing one to fillet him while the other watched. If you don't know what fillet means, look it up. I really don't want to explain it. It's disgusting. He also abused them physically, beating them for no apparent reason with his hands and sticks. And it wasn't long before the women were totally cowed and completely terrified of him. So he didn't exactly lay out a regal repast for them either. Sometimes he gave them oatmeal for breakfast or Pop-Tarts or crackers, and for lunch, sandwiches sometimes, and a really special treat was takeout chicken. But he also offered them sandwiches with dog food, which they obviously rejected. But as their hunger deepened, he refused to feed them until they accepted the dog food sandwiches, he would then give them. So, to compound their grief, it was the end of November, so it's winter. The basement's probably chilly. It's dirt floor. It's damp because it's a basement, and basements tend to get pretty damp. And neither woman was dressed warmly. And actually, at one point, they were completely bare from the waist down, which is terrifying. Now, 3 days before Christmas in 1986, Heidnick captured a new girl. Her name was Lisa Thomas, and she was 19 years old, and she was apparently very nice looking. It doesn't give me a picture. She was walking down Lay Street when her life intersected with Heidnick's. He was cruising along in his Cadillac and pulled up beside her and asked her ingenuously, "You want to see my Peter?" Lisa responded that she was no prostitute, that she was just on her way to a girlfriend's house. Heidnick assured her that he was not dangerous and that he would be happy to give her a lift, and after some discussion, Lisa decided he was harmless and got into the car. Before they got to her destination, Heidnick took her to a restaurant for a cheeseburger and fries, flashed a roll of bills, and asked her if she wanted to accompany him to Atlantic City. She said she had nothing to wear for such an outing, and he said he'd be happy to buy her whatever she needed. So he took her to a store, bought her an armful of jeans and blouses, and after that they went to his house and had sex on his waterbed, where she eventually fell asleep. When she awoke, she asked Heidnick to take her to her girlfriend's apartment, and he changed from a seemingly harmless man to something else, grabbed her around the throat and choked her just like he did with Josephina. Later, court wags would dub this the Heidnick maneuver. Lisa begged him to stop and said she'd do whatever he wanted, so he took her down to the basement and introduced her to Josephina, who had told Heidnick her name was Nicole, and Sandra. Then he humiliated Lisa in front of Josephina and Sandra, told her to kiss his behind, which she did, and he then forced her to suck my balls, which she also did, and then he forced her to suck my Peter, which the girl also complied with. Afterward, Heidnick served peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which was something of a treat, and completed his day's work by cuffing and chaining Lisa to the metal bar. Now, Heidnick's fourth captive was Deborah Dudley. Now, every time I hear that, I think of Dudley Vernon or Dudley Dursley, so I picture her fat. Sure, she wasn't. Doesn't say she was overweight or anything. His fifth captive was 18-year-old Jacqueline Askins, taken just 4 days after Deborah Dudley. Askins was a prostitute. Dudley was not. This also doesn't tell us how old Deborah Dudley was. It was midday when Heidnick, driving a blue Dodge van with an imitation fur interior, picked Askins up. Now, she's 18. Okay? When he got her to his house, he didn't worry about having sex with her. He just dragged her into the basement, and with the other captives watching, thrashed her with a plastic switch and then chained her up. He now had 5 female African-American captives in his basement, and some of them had been there for months. Sometime during all of this, Heidnick had devised a special punishment for the slaves who did not obey him, or whom he decided did not obey him. He dug a hole in the cellar floor, because remember, it's just dirt, covered it with a plywood panel, and then to discipline someone, he would make her get into the hole. He would then cover the hole with the plywood and weigh it down with sandbags, so they can't get out. So it was an ordeal within an ordeal. It may also have served as inspiration for the author Thomas Harris, who had his fictional psychopath in the book The Silence of the Lambs hold women captive in a deep well-like hole in his basement. So, Heidnick's sexual activity continued, and it often involved humiliating the women. For example, he would occasionally force the women to have sex with one another while he watched. Dog food eventually became a staple in their diet, but all of them still lost weight and, of course, were hungry all the time. They certainly didn't lack for music, though. Heidnick kept the radio blasting rock music 24 hours a day. And that is one reason why they had determined screaming would not help them, because no one would be able to hear them about the music. Now, despite all of Heidnick's sexual activity, none of the women ever became pregnant, though there were a few false alarms when 2 missed their periods. Heidnick had been forced to buy tampons for all of the women. Later, it would be determined that Heidnick's main goal was to impregnate them. He viewed the basement as kind of a baby farm, but he was unable to achieve that goal. There's no telling how he would have reacted if one of them had become pregnant, because luckily, none of them did. Something eventually occurred that made the situation in the basement particularly terrifying for the abused women. Sandra Lindsley died. On February 7th of 1987, she had a fever and was feeling very washed out. She seemed to have no energy. Heidnick tried to force her to eat, and he suddenly realized that she was not moving because she had died. If the event bothered him, he didn't show it, merely commenting that he had choked on a piece of bread, or that she had choked on a piece of bread, but he had to get rid of the body. So he carried it out of the room, and the next thing the prisoners heard was the sound of a power tool. They imagined he was cutting Sandra up, and they were right. Heidnick dismembered Sandra Lindsley, packed parts of her in white plastic bags, and put them in the freezer, and used a food processor to grind up some of her body. The parts he couldn't use, the head, feet, hands, ribcage, and bones, he tried to cook away. And it was this burning flesh smell that the neighbors had complained about. The cooked flesh did not go to waste. He started mixing it with dog food and fed it to his two dogs, Bear and Flaky, and the prisoners. It is not known whether they knew that they were eating human flesh. Of all the girls, Deborah Dudley was the most rebellious, and she challenged his power daily. So he needed a special lesson to get her to obey him. So one day he took her upstairs, opened the freezer, and showed her Sandra Lindsley's head and other body parts that he had cut up. He told her that if she did not comply, she would end up the same way, but she was tough and continued to fight his will, and Heidnick finally devised a special torture for her. So one night he put her in that hole that he had partially filled with water, then plugged a wire into a wall outlet and touched her hands with the bare end of the wire. So the pain was excruciating, and he repeated it as much as he wished, as often as he wished, and ultimately the pain ended her life. So she took one too many shocks and died. And instead of cutting her up, Heidnick dumped her body in the pine barrens in a New Jersey park far from North Marshall Street. Now that had a softening effect on Heidnick. He started to treat the women better and supplied them with blankets, pillow, and even a television. That does not mean he stopped kidnapping them. On March 23rd, 1987, he captured 24-year-old Agnes Adams. So at this time, he's down to 3 African-American women. Sandra Lindsley died, and Deborah Dudley is dead. So he's down to 3. So he kidnaps 24-year-old up to 4. Now, Heidnick had paid her for sex on 2 prior occasions. The first time he could not get her into his house because someone had parked their cars in front of his driveway, and the second time he paid her $35 for oral sex, and for some unaccountable reason, let her go. The third time they met, she was working 5th and Girard Streets, and this time he brought her home, and she was forced to stay. During her captivity, Heidnick's first prisoner, Josephina Rivera, using all her street-smart ways, had gradually won over his trust. Now, she had shown her loyalty when he abducted Agnes Adams, because she was in the car with him when he encountered Agnes for the 3rd time. Agnes knew Josephina as Vicky from the Hearts and Flowers strip joint. Now, she made no attempt to warn Agnes that she was dealing with a madman, so Agnes felt that it was safe. So, when Josephina asked Heidnick if she could see her children and family, he said she could, but if she didn't return, all the other women would die. So Heidnick drove her into town, and she agreed to meet him at a gas station at midnight at 6th and Girard Streets. She also promised to bring another woman with her. Now, after he released her, she immediately ran the 4 blocks to the apartment of her boyfriend, Vincent Nelson. He was there. Hysterically, she blurted out the story of where she had been and the horrors. The boyfriend was skeptical, but after a while, he began to believe her and told her to come with him, and he would confront Heidnick at the gas station and beat him up. On the way over, though, he had second thoughts about the solidity of his plan, and they called 911. Now, the responding officers doubted her story, too, until she showed them the marks made by the chains and cuffs. So they all went to the gas station, found him in his car, and arrested him without incident. On March 25th, 1987, Philadelphia detectives armed with a search warrant entered his house. Downstairs, they found 3 of them in the basement. Two of them, Lisa Thomas, and Jacqueline Askins, were huddled under a blanket, trying to keep warm. They screamed hysterically, and when they stood up, the blankets dropped off and revealed that they were nude from the waist down. The cops found Agnes Adams in the hole. She was nude, her hands cupped behind her back. During the search of Heidnick's house, one detective got an unpleasant surprise. He found the packaged human flesh, the human body remains in a burned pan, and on the shelf in the freezer, a human forearm. Now, he was born in Cleveland in 1943 and one sibling, a younger brother. His name was Terry. His mother, Ellen, who was a nice-looking woman and part Native American, slept around. When Gary was 2 years old, his parents divorced. And after the divorce, Gary and his brother lived with their mother, who seemed incapable of taking care of them very soon after that. Around the time they entered the first grade, the boys went to live with their father, Michael, who had remarried. They would not live with their mother again, who married 3 more times before committing suicide by ingesting mercury in 1970. Gary had described his father as cold and uncaring, a strict disciplinarian, but a psychiatrist who spoke to Gary said that this description of his father is a gross understatement. For example, when Gary or his brother wet the bed, his father would hang the sheets out the window to show the world what piss asses they were. Or he would paint bullseyes on the brothers' pants to show the other boys at school where to kick them. And if Gary or Terry were really bad, punishment could be just about anything, including being hung out the windows by their ankles. So Gary's father was totally uncaring when it came to his son, or both of his sons. Indeed, when Gary was arrested, his father acted as if Gary had brought all his troubles on himself. And when Gary was sentenced to death, his father, who he hadn't spoken to in 25 years, said, "I'm not interested. I don't care. It don't bother me a bit. All I want is for you people to leave me alone. I don't care what happens." So Gary and Terry were in and out of mental institutions throughout their lives, and both brothers had tried to commit suicide on numerous occasions. Terry had tried it just a few times, but Gary tried it 13 different times, using everything from driving his motorcycle into a truck to stockpiling Thorazine while he was in the hospital and trying to overdose on it. Now, growing up, Gary was extremely interested in the military and in finance. He actually attended a military high school for a couple of years, which is actually really interesting. He had been reading the financial pages since he was a kid, and as an adult, he used his intellect and experience to amass a small fortune in stocks. Now, he was arrested a few times for assault and did prison time, but overall, he spent the bulk of his years in mental institutions, and just about everyone who examined him considered him dangerous. Schizophrenic and incurable are the words they used. One particularly startling symptom was that he sometimes went mute, did not utter so much as a word once for almost 2 years. I think this is schizophrenia. Now, Heidnick also seemed to be afraid of women who were his intellectual equals, and even women of just average intelligence, which explains his attraction to Sandra Lindsley. Except for a brief marriage to a woman of average intelligence for years before he abducted women to become his slaves, he became involved with women only who were intellectually inferior to him. One, for example, had an IQ of 49. A person with an IQ of 70 or below is considered to have mental retardation. This was part of a broader pattern of constantly getting involved with people whom Heidnick could feel superior to. When his father had power and superiority over him, Gary associated with people over whom he could feel powerful. Now, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Before his execution, however, he was housed in the State Correctional Institution at Pittsburgh because of a change of venue granted to the defense during the trial. Since the age of 14, Heidnick had been in 21 different mental institutions and had tried to kill himself 13 times. People who knew him well predicted that he would go for number 14, but he never got the chance. He was executed on July 6, 1999. Had he been housed in a prison instead of a mental institution, he probably would have tried for time 14, but due to the fact that you were under 24-hour surveillance at mental institutions, he wasn't given the chance. So, yeah. That's all I got. I'm sorry, it's kind of graphic, it's kind of dark, but it's the killer book of serial killers. What are you expecting?